Hello everybody, welcome to Weekly Tech. Today in this video, we will discuss about promise, async and await in JavaScript. Before coming to the point, I really want to spare a few minutes on what is synchronous and asynchronous code or what is blocking and non-blocking code. Meanwhile, after a few minutes, we'll discuss about what are promises, why they were introduced, what is async and await. So the first code snippet is a blocking code. The line number second will do a read file sync and it will wait for the whole file.md to be loaded on the memory, and then it will move to the next line. So it will block the whole execution. So this is a synchronous and a blocking code. Meanwhile, on the other hand, this second code snippet is a asynchronous non-blocking code. It won't block the execution, and the callback function, this callback function will be executed once the whole file.md gets loaded or gets read. So this is the difference between a blocking and a non-blocking or a synchronous versus asynchronous code. Synchronous code is executed line by line. Line number third will only get executed once and only once the line number second is finished executing. But it's not the case with asynchronous code. Asynchronous code won't block the execution. Everything in JavaScript is a result of an event. For example, when a user moves his mouse, execute a function. When the user press a key, execute a second function. You cannot load the whole JavaScript or run the JavaScript from top to bottom every time there is an activity done by user. This will crash the whole browser. This event-driven nature or non-blocking behavior of JavaScript is used heavily to load the dynamic content that or the data that can be come from a remote server, to add that data dynamically on the HTML page without actually loading the whole page. That's what we call an Ajax call, and we'll start what is promise and then we'll gradually shift to async and await. So we'll use JavaScript from the browser to make a HTTP GET call on this URL, and this URL will provide us the details of a country, for example India in our case this time. So we are interested in the name of the country, the capital of the country and the borders of the country. After getting the borders of the country, we'll take the first border from the borders array, and then we'll make the same HTTP GET call on the first border, and then we'll make a third HTTP call from the border that we are getting from the borders array of this AFG country. So there will be three HTTP call, and the second one is dependent on the first one to get finished, and the third one is dependent on the second and the first one to get finished. So let's code it. We'll start with our traditional approach of creating an Ajax call first. So const xhr equal to, then we'll open this xhr with a method of get, and the URL will be this URL. Then we will send this Ajax call, and we'll wait for a add event listener on load, so that once the HTTP call is finished, we'll get the data inside this callback, and we'll execute a callback here. Oh, sorry, no arrow functions, I'm sorry. And the response that will be coming, will take the response a variable country data equal to JSON dot parse, and data will be coming in this variable response text. We'll make a console.log to check everything is fine till now. Let's see, and yes, we are receiving the data name, capital, and where is the border? There is the border. So we'll take this first border to make the same request, to get the borders of this country, and then we'll make another request to the borders, to the first border of the borders array of this country. Okay, we use template literal. Country will be country data dot name, country India, capital New Delhi, and Afghanistan. This. Now the second HTTP call is dependent on this function to get executed. This function, this callback function. Once this callback function is done, then only we'll get the borders of our first country, and we'll extract the borders, the first border from the borders array. So this, we cannot make the second call before the first call is finished. Okay, so this is a dependency. Now we'll use another HTTP or another AJAX call. We'll make another AJAX call, second HTTP call. Then in the second HTTP call, we'll first extract the border, the first border. Okay, now we are interested in this border 1 country. Now what we'll do, we'll copy this one, our first open call, and we'll border 1. Oh, I'm sorry, we need to use XHR1 because this is our, so let me make it XHR. Again, we need to attach an event listener. So the country will be border1 data dot name, capital will be border1 data dot capital, and borders will be this, and we'll extract border 2 equal to border1 data dot borders first index. Okay, let's console it. Oh, a small problem here. We need to use XHR2 for the event listener. See, the first country was India and the second one was Afghanistan. Now we are interested in this IRN country code to get our last, or to make our last HTTP call and get the borders of IRN country or Iran. I think so. So let's make our second HTTP, sorry, the third HTTP call. And in this case, we'll use XHR3 third AJAX call, and we'll replace border 1 with border 2, and then we'll do a XHR3 dot send to send the request, and then we'll wait on XHR3 for the data to come. And once the data is arrived, we'll execute a callback on that, and that callback will be nothing but to extract the borders of our last country. Let border dot parse this dot response text, and we'll use this console log to save some time. We'll change the variables accordingly. Border 2 data here, border 2 data, and border 2 data. Let's execute it. Okay, we got India, Afghanistan, and Iran. So now if you look this call closely, so as you have seen, the third HTTP call is dependent on the second one, and the second one is dependent on the first one. And if you can see an arrow here, an arrow pattern here of the parentheses like this one, and the code is going like this. This is just 3 call. What if your real use case includes 10 or 12 calls? So this can have callback inside callback and callback inside callback, and this is what we call callback hell. And to overcome from this callback hell, ES 2015, in ES 6 or in ES 2015, promises were introduced. So what are promises? Promise is an object that is used as a placeholder for the future result of an asynchronous function. Okay, all this AJAX call is an asynchronous function, but somehow we made it synchronous, that the second one is getting executed only after the result of first one is arrived, and the third one is getting executed once the first and the second one is finished, because we have put the second call and the third call inside a callback of a callback. but this can create callback hell, and to overcome this, promise were introduced. So promise, again I'm repeating it, promise is an object that is used as a placeholder for the future result of an asynchronous call. In the layman term, it is just a container or a placeholder for a future result. Instead of callback hell, we can chain promises for a sequence of asynchronous call, just like we have a sequence of 3 asynchronous ajax call. So what is the advantage of promise? By using promise, we no longer need to rely on events and on callback. We can chain the promise for the sequence of asynchronous call. So from here we'll learn about what is promise. So first we'll try to create a promise. We'll see some more definitions of promise, what are the methods available in promise, and then we'll consume a promise. I'll show you everything. Okay, so let me just finish comment this out. So from here we'll create a promise. Okay, you can consider promise as a lottery. Okay, you have a lottery ticket, and if you are having the same number which can win you the lottery, you will get the money. So money in our case is data, lottery is promise. So lottery can be either fulfilled or rejected. On the same way, promise can be fulfilled or rejected. Promise can be resolved or rejected. When I'm saying promise can be resolved, that means it is a success. When I'm saying promise can be rejected, that means it's a failure. When you are getting a data from an ajax call, that is a success. That means the promise will be resolved. If I'm saying that there is some problem in your ajax call and you are getting error, in that case the promise is rejected. So promise can return two state, either it is resolved or rejected. Asynchronous call in the promise is not over. We can say the promise is in the pending phase, and once the promise is either resolved or rejected, we can say the promise is settled. Okay, so three terminologies here. If I'm saying the promise is settled, that means the promise is either resolved or rejected. By resolved, I mean the promise is fulfilled or the promise is successful. By rejected, I mean the promise is failed or errored out. So let me create a promise. Const my first promise, and we need to use a promise constructor here. New promise. Please note these two arguments, resolve and reject. You can also type it as res or rejected, or you can type your name to xyz and abc. Anything will work, but the order or the sequence is must here. It is mandatory that the first one should be resolved and the second one should be rejected. So in our case, let's make it the way everyone does it: resolve and reject. So if I do resolved promise. Okay, so this is the value that promise will return. And to check whether my first promise is actually successful, or that means resolved or fulfilled, we need to use the dot then method. Dot then method will capture a value that is returned from the promise if the promise is resolved. So we simply log the val here, and if the promise is rejected, it will be cached or returned in the catch block. So we can simply use val here to check the error why it was rejected. So let me call it as reason of rejection. Let's check here. Yeah, resolve promise. Okay, now let me comment this out and reject the promise, saying rejected promise. Now it will go to the catch block. Okay, it won't go to the then block. Let me console here also in the catch block and in the then block. Let me rerun it. In the catch block, a rejected promise, and in the then block, the resolved promise. As I said, you can rename it anything, but the pattern is mandatory: ABC and XYZ. So you can do ABC, just a callback, and you'll get XYZ. and the result is same. Okay, so just for the sake of to keep the things clear and clean, we'll use the existing variable. If I'm saying fulfill or resolve is the same thing, so from now I'll say resolve for success and reject for error. Okay, so let's discuss some more methods that are available with promise. The first one or the first two are resolve and reject. You can use it like this, equal to promise dot resolve. It will resolve the promise, resolved promise. And on the same way, you can use promise dot rejected to reject the promise as soon as it is created. So resolved promise, so in this case it is a resolved promise, so the then block will be executed in this case, and for the second promise, rejected promise, the catch block will be executed. And you'll see for the first one in the then block a resolved promise, and in the for the second one in the catch block I'm sorry, there was a typo, a rejected promise, like this. Okay, so you can use promise dot resolve and reject directly to resolve and reject the promise. Now coming to the next pair, that is all and all settled. So promise dot all is used when you have a use case of, let's say you want to make n number of HTTP call, and the sequence is not mandatory, but all of them should get executed, then only you want to execute the next instruction. Okay, so one by one is not necessary. Anyone can finish at any time, but all of them should be finished, and then only you want to execute the next instruction. So in that case, you want to execute all the promises asynchronously, then you want to wait on all of them to get finished, and then you want to execute the next set of instructions. So this is possible by using promise.all. Promise.all will accept an array of promises and will execute all those promises asynchronously, and then it will go to the next instruction or in the dot then or in the dot cache block. And let me create another promise which says const delayed promise, and I'll put a set timeout inside this new promise resolve reject, and I'll do a set timeout. So I'll resolve the promise inside the set timeout, resolve the promise after 1 second, and resolve it with the value of resolved delayed. Okay, so we have 4 promises. One is the traditional way of creating a promise. Second one is to resolve it immediately at the time of creating it, and the third one is rejecting it at the time of creating it, and the fourth one is resolve the promise after 1 second. Okay, and you want all of them to be executed asynchronously, but you want the next set of instruction to be executed only all of them will be finished. So you can use promise.all in that case. So promise.all will return array of values that are coming from the promises which are getting executed asynchronously. So promise.all, and this require an array of promises. So we'll give first promise, then the second promise, then the third promise, and the fourth one, and then we'll do a dot then, and in dot then we'll receive an array of values coming from the promises. So our first promise is a resolved one, our second promise is also a resolved one, our third promise is a rejected one, and our fourth promise is a delayed promise, but it's a resolved one. So in this case the output will be a rejected promise. Okay, so I haven't got the result of first promise, resolved promise, or delayed promise. I got the result of only the rejected promise. Okay, so a point to be noted here. promise dot all will reject as soon as one promise is rejected. It won't wait for other promises to be settled. It will reject as soon as one of the promise is rejected. In our case, the third promise is getting rejected. That's why it's getting or is coming in the catch block. Okay, so what to do in this case? So you can use all settled, promise dot all settled. So promise dot all settled will wait for all the promises to get settled. Okay, so you can use all settled, and all settled method will wait for all the promises to be settled and will return the results accordingly. So let me comment out this one, promise dot all, and let's see the result of promise dot all settled. The status will be fulfilled for the first promise and the value is a resolved promise, and for the third or for the second promise, again the status is fulfilled, a resolved promise, and the value is a resolved promise that we are returning from here, a resolved promise. When this and the third one is a rejected promise, status is rejected, and this is the value that is getting rejected. And the third one is a delayed promise, but it's getting resolved, and because that's why the status is fulfilled and the value is a resolved delayed promise. Let's move on to our last two pair, that is promise.raise and promise.any. What if you want to get the first promise that is getting settled in all of them? Okay, and this is a very good use case where you want to time out an HTTP request after a certain time. Okay, so you have put a HTTP request inside a promise, and you want to go ahead with the next set of instruction if the HTTP call passes 5 seconds. So you can have a race between two promises. One is your HTTP call and the second one will be a set timeout of 5 seconds. Which one that will get finished first will be picked, and we'll move on to our next set of instructions. So let me create a, so we have a delayed promise here. Okay, we'll use the same promise here and we'll use delayed, and we'll call it delayed resolved promise, and the second one will be delayed rejected promise. Resolve, and we'll reject it here, this one. Let me comment out all of them just to keep the output screen clear. So we have three promise here. One is getting resolved immediately, and next one, the second one is getting resolved after 1 second, 500 millisecond. So promise.any, please note the difference here. Promise.any will return the first fulfilled promise. Okay, so this will return the first fulfilled promise, and promise.raise will return the first settled promise. Okay, so the promise.any will return the first promise that is resolved, that is successful, and promise.raise will return the first promise that is settled. So by settled I mean the state can be either resolved or rejected. If I'll give an array of promises to .any, the catch block here, the catch block, and in then block, just to get an understanding that in which block it is coming. Okay, so in this case the first resolved promise is this one, immediately that is getting resolved. So the output will be in the then block and a resolved promise. Okay, it will return the first resolved promise, the first fulfilled promise. It won't wait for the rest of the promise to be resolved. So what if all the promises are getting rejected? There is no promise which is getting resolved. Okay, so let me grab a immediately rejecting promise, put it here. Again, I'll put a rejected promise and I'll remove the delayed resolved one. Okay, so there will be only two promise and both of them getting rejected, but one is getting rejected immediately and the other one is getting rejected after half a second, and promise.any will return only the first fulfilled promise. Pause the video for a moment and think of the output. You'll get an output like this: all the promise will be rejected. There is nothing in the .then block. So now if I introduce another promise in promise.any array, which is getting resolved after 1 second, so you'll get after 1 second a resolved delayed promise. Okay, so let me make it resolved 1000 ms delayed and delayed promise. Okay, now the first promise that is getting settled will be returned. So let me put it here. Okay, so in this case, yeah, so first one is the resolved one, which is getting resolved immediately. The second one is a resolved promise, which is getting resolved after 1 second, and the third one is a rejected promise, which is getting rejected after 500 seconds. Okay, so it will promise.raise will return the first settled promise. Settled can be either rejected or resolved, but it should be settled. So in this case, the first promise is getting settled immediately. What do you think? Which one is getting settled immediately, or among these three, which one is getting settled first? The resolved promise is getting settled first, because this delayed resolved and delayed rejected has a timeout of 100 and 500 milliseconds respectively in the then block a resolved promise. Okay, if I remove this resolved promise, and there will be a race between two promises. One is a delayed one. Let me comment out this rejected promise, because we are not handling it anywhere, and that's why we are getting an error in the console like this, because we are not handling it anywhere, right? Now among these three promises, the resolved promise is getting settled first one, that's why it is returned. And in these two promises, both of them are having a timeout. One is having a timeout of 1 second, and the second one is having a timeout of half a second. The first one, which is getting settled, is a delayed promise and will be in the catch block with a rejected promise. So that is the difference between promise.any and promise.raise. Promise.any will wait for the first fulfilled or resolved promise, and promise.raise will return the first settled promise. So now let's come back to our first requirement or first use case, and let's handle that use case of that AJAX call or the HTTP call by using promises. And we'll use the fetch API, and in this case we'll consume a promise. So fetch API or fetch method will return a promise, and we need to consume it. Okay, so we will use our first URL and we'll give it to fetch. So we need to use .then method to capture the value, or to get the value of the resolved response from the response.json. Now we need to use, let's call it country data. So I'll use the same console.log that I used earlier, just to save some time the output. Okay, now I'm interested in the border of the first, and then I'll use this border variable to make our next fetch call, and the variable name will be border1. Okay, this will return a promise, so we'll use .then. Now if you are getting what I am trying to show here, that it's again creating a arrow or triangular pattern. So the one method to get a readout from this triangular pattern and to have a chain of promises to return the promise from here itself, and you'll return this promise, which will be captured here itself, the returned value or the resolved value of this fetch request, because you are returning it from here. Border1 data, let me code it quickly. This console log here, country will be border1 data, border1 data, border1 data. Copy this fetch call and I'll replace border1 with border2, and this fetch call will return a promise. we'll get the output like in a sequential way, like India, Afghanistan, Iran, just that we are getting with the Ajax call in the callback hell. But the one thing that need to be noted from here is, again with this promise chain, we are getting this triangular pattern, this arrow pattern. Again, it's a chain of promises which is creating this mess. It makes our code hard to maintain and hard to read, and the code which is hard to read or hard to understand is a bad code. So this is not the way we should code, and that's where async await were introduced. Async await, so let's discuss about async await. Let me comment this out and come down, and in this section we'll discuss about async and await. So async and await is just a syntactic sugar over promises dot then and dot catch block. So let me just grab the URL, our first URL, and I'll make a simple HTTP call on our first URL just to see whether everything will be working, and then we'll complete the whole use case. Where's the URL? Okay, this is the URL. So I'll make one HTTP call on this URL by using async and await. So let me create a function, and that function will be responsible to make a HTTP call, and let's name it get results. Async, the async keyword is mandatory here, and I'll use the same URL and the same fetch API to make the HTTP call. Let's say it as let res equal to fetch and our URL, and let me have an argument of this function and call it country. So every time we'll call this function, we'll pass an argument of the country, the 3-digit code, and let me make it a template literal, and so that everything will be working fine. And now this response will again be a promise, so we'll do a rest.json and we'll return this rest.json. So please note this async keyword is mandatory here, and async will follow up with await. So we are making a fetch request, so we need to put an await here, and rest.json will also return a promise, so we need to put await here too. So we'll put await here, and this whole async function will be asynchronous to the execution. It won't block the execution. Okay, so please note, it won't block the execution, it will be asynchronous with the whole execution thread. The best way or the good way is to put it in a try catch block. So let me put it in a try catch block and console.log the error of the catch block for now. And now we'll call this function from a different function, and we'll call this get results function every time with a different country code. So get countries data equal to, again, async followed by a try catch block. We should put a try catch block, and we'll call this function get results. So every time we want to make a so the first call will give us the let country data, and we'll wait for the fetch call to get complete, and fetch call is inside the get results function. So get result function will again return a promise, and so we'll await on that, and we'll call the get results by the ind country, and let's put the whole thing in a try catch block as we said earlier. Now the data that is coming from the country data, let's make it a good console or the console, and let's try whether we are receiving the correct output or not. Okay, we need to call the function. I'm sorry for that. We should call it, and then let's check the output. Okay, we are getting the output. Now we'll use the output of this call as an input to the another HTTP call. So let's do it fast. So this time I want border 1 data. I'll do an await. We'll call the same function with the argument of the first HTTP calls result dot borders and first index, and then we'll use the same console log, and I'll copy paste it here just to save some time, and we'll change the variables accordingly. And then we'll make our third HTTP and the final HTTP call. As of now, both the HTTP calls are working. We're using async and await, and let's grab the third one. And again, these two HTTP calls are in asynchronous with the whole execution. This whole get countries data will be asynchronous to the execution thread, but these two calls, get results, first call with the IND and the second one with the borders of IND, will be executed in synchronous way, one by one, but this whole function will be asynchronous with the execution. Now let's make our third HTTP call, the final one. Let border 2 data equal to await, again to wait for the results, get results, and now I'm interested in the border 1 data dot borders first index. Border 1 data will be replaced by border 2 data, and let's check the output. India, Afghanistan and Iran. Fantastic. This is the third time we are doing the same thing, third time the same output, but the first one we did it with the XHR call, AJAX call, second time we did it with a promise chain, and the third time we did it with the most elegant way. The perfect way to do it is using async and await. So we should use async and await, and look how beautiful and readable the code is looking. So that's it, folks. Please let me know if you have any query and suggestion and any feedback in the comment section. I'm sorry for the noise distortion and disturbance in between the video. I muted it for some time. I'm sorry for that. I'll keep in mind for the next time. Let me know if you have any queries and suggestion. Please like, share and subscribe. Thank you guys.